Hey everyone, this is CowTipper Vern. Welcome back to CowTipper Vern's X2x2 review. Today I'm talking about the Bible, so heads up, trigger warning, Bible stuff. When I first started my channel, I had an idea to do a two-part series about things that I was learning since leaving the 2x2s. Part 1 I actually did. There's an old episode now called something like Things That I Learned Since Leaving the 2x2s, and the theme of that was things that I'd learned about the 2x2s since leaving the 2x2s. The idea being that as my beliefs changed a lot, I could look back and see things that I was maybe ignorant of before I had left, or maybe just notice how the culture is a little weirder under the hood than I'd originally thought. So I thought it would be fun to explore that. And then part 2 was supposed to be looking the other way, looking out at the Bible world, the Christian world, evangelical Christianity, all the places that we used to call religious, worldly religions, and look at how they looked at the Bible. The idea there being that I'd grown up with a certain idea of Christianity and the Bible and things like that, and it would be interesting to take another look at that, take another look at the religious world, learn more about the teachings, learn more about how people viewed the Bible, how people viewed their beliefs, mostly within evangelical Christianity, because that's what I'm most familiar with. But basically, I just wanted to look at worldly religions, such as they are, and compare and contrast. My assumption was that the worldly churches weren't super weird like the 2x2s. The 2x2s have such a specific reading of a specific Bible that I thought maybe I would learn something by looking at religions that also use the Bible, but maybe a different Bible, and read it a little differently. But that second episode never got made. I've started it several times. In fact, I recorded a whole episode, and it just didn't sit right with me, and so I shelved it, and I've sat on it for a long time. I went ahead and released the first part as things I've learned since leaving the 2x2s, and that's one of my favorite episodes. But I just never got back around to the second part, part 2, so it's not really a series anymore, it's just a separate episode. Today, I'm going to do that episode, but it's going to be completely different than what I originally thought I was going to do. Because the more I've looked into worldly churches, quote unquote, or evangelical Christianity, or the Bible itself, the more I've realized there's a lot more complexity than I was ready for. And so this episode doesn't sound like I originally thought it would. My original assumption was that the 2x2s read the Bible so strangely that other churches probably had it right. There's lots of things that people realize when they leave meetings that the Christian world at large doesn't agree with 2x2s on. That seems pretty obvious because, of course, they're worldly, but some of those things are interesting, and a lot of those things are pretty significant. A lot of people leave meetings and realize that most of the Christian world talks about, say, the Trinity, for example, Jesus as God, stuff like that. Or they talk about grace. Grace doctrine is a big deal for people leaving meetings because they realize that not every Christian church makes you earn it constantly. Or at least that's a perception. So my perception as well was along those lines, was thinking, well, maybe they have a better reading of the Bible. I'm not sure that I think that anymore. So I'm going to put a bunch of trigger warnings and disclaimers and all kinds of stuff up front in this episode because I'm not sure everybody's going to like it. So hang with me. I'm going to talk about the episode a little bit before I even start the episode. The Christian world has a lot of assumptions about the Bible and about their own belief, just like the 2x2s do. And the more I learn about them, the more I realize that I don't necessarily agree with those assumptions. And as I've gotten less religious over time, I'm less open to some of those ideas. So I realized when looking at other evangelical Christian religions and churches, they all have their assumptions as well. They have assumptions about the Bible. They have assumptions about what's in the Bible, what the Bible says, what's inspired, what isn't, what means what. And I realized what I was actually doing was trying to learn about the Bible and not so much about religion. So this episode is way less about religion than it is about the Bible. I'm going to comment on religion as I go, comment on Christian theology and things, but not that much. It's not as interesting to me as the Bible itself. So this episode's mostly about the Bible and things that I've learned about the Bible since leaving the 2x2s. It's kind of a big deal to learn about the Bible. 2x2s really don't like to mess with scripture, and a lot of Christian religions are this way as well. You know, the Bible has a certain aura about it, that it's spirit-led, that it's God-breathed, things like that. So just the idea about learning about the Bible, reading it a little differently, reading different versions of it and learning about the history of it feel really uncomfortable for a 2x2. And so I think that's all I've really done here. I haven't gotten into religion as much. I've just gotten into the Bible itself. 2x2s talk about how in 2 Timothy it says, Scripture's inspired by God. It's good for doctrine and reproof. Revelation says, don't take away from this book, which the 2x2s say means the whole Bible. And I think assumptions like this, the fear of really analyzing the Bible and thinking about it, is why the 2x2s skip around so much. Why workers tell stories with just a little bit of Bible here and a little bit of Bible there, grabbing a verse here, grabbing half a verse somewhere else, and parsing the Bible up a lot into little parts that they can understand. So I realized as I was doing this little project that that's actually what I was interested in, was just learning the rest of the Bible, learning about it. Not the rest of it in the sense of that I read the whole thing again, which I have before, but more about learning the history of the Bible, learning what the Bible means, learning about the languages, and learning about Bible from Bible scholars. So that's what this episode actually is. This is just a set of things that I find interesting about the Bible since leaving the 2x2s. A few disclaimers up front. There's actually probably a lot of disclaimers. I might have more disclaimers than actual text on this one. I'm not sure, but I have a lot of notes. First of all, if you're listening to this and you're spiritual, you believe the Bible is literal, God-breathed, etc., inspired, this might not be the episode for you, because I'm not reading the Bible that way. The main disclaimer I want to get across for this episode is to be honest about where I'm coming from. I am not a spiritual leader. I'm not a religious leader in any sense. I don't want to be, and I don't want people to follow me. If you listen to this episode, really all you're doing is listening to somebody talk about the Bible in a new way, and that's it. I'm just going to talk about things that I've learned and find interesting, and that's about it. There's really no agenda to this at all. I have no purpose other than that I think this is interesting and fun to talk about, and that's it. So disclaimer number one is that I'm not a religious leader or a spiritual leader, so I'm not going to talk like one. Disclaimer number two is that I'm also not a Bible scholar. I just like this stuff. I think it's interesting to learn about, interesting to talk about, and that's it. Anybody else can do the same thing. I typically don't like to talk about sources or credit things to people because I don't like it to look like I'm following people, and I don't necessarily like to endorse anybody. So typically I haven't done that on this series of episodes. Most of the episodes I don't talk about where I got the information necessarily, mostly because it's just me talking, but also I don't like to drag other people into my stuff, and I don't like to make it look like I'm trying to push anybody in any sort of direction with any sort of agenda. But I will give a few sources for my info on this one, because I think it's interesting and because there's no way I could have come up with this stuff on my own. So as such, no hard feelings if you don't want to listen to this episode. I don't blame anybody for thinking, hey, I don't like talking about the Bible this way. I believe the Bible is inspired. I don't want to listen to this episode. No problem. Carry on. This episode is secular. If you want to expand or deepen your faith, this isn't it. As such, I'm not assuming religious things when I talk about the Bible here either, like univocality or any theological standpoint or religious assumption or assertion. I'll bring some of those things up, but I'm not talking about those today. I have no agenda. I'm just doing this for fun because it interests me, and I don't care if you believe or not. I have no vested interest in how you approach the Bible. I do have some assumptions of my own built into this, though. I'm going to talk a lot about Bible scholars today, and I should probably define that term so at least you know what I'm talking about. When I talk about a Bible scholar, I think of this as a completely distinct category from Christian apologist. Bible scholar and Christian apologist are not the same thing. I'm going to talk about the former, only a little bit about the latter in the cases where they intersect. In the cases where those categories may intersect a little bit because it's interesting where it happens. I see these things conflated a lot, and it really bums me out. Bible scholars are scholars of the Bible and religion and linguistics and things like that. If a Bible scholar speaks mostly on behalf of an apologist organization or a church, or speaks from a place of belief primarily, first and foremost, from an apologetic standpoint, I'm going to assume they're an apologist, and I'm not going to reference them in this episode. I don't really respect apologists who act like scholars. There's a handful of scholars out there. There's actually a lot of Bible scholars out there, and I'm going to reference some of my favorites, but there are too many to name or count. They're everywhere. And they're really interesting, really insightful, thoughtful, and bring a lot to the conversation around the Bible. The scholastic the scholarly conversation around the Bible, and belief in some cases. I don't think apologists do the same. I think an apologist is a different kind of a thing. An apologist who calls himself or herself a scholar, I think is doing a disservice to their audience. And I bring that up because there are some of those out there. There's a rather famous apologist who's been on a lot of big podcasts and stuff lately and has said a lot of random nonsense that only a religious person could believe, but a scholar would never believe. And I see that guy get parroted a lot, and I don't like it because I don't think it's honest. Apologists mimic other apologists when they think that the other apologists are being scholarly, and most of the time they're not. And I think that's dishonest, and I think everybody should identify themselves. So I'll identify myself in this episode as I am a random dude who just read some stuff and listened to podcasts and enjoyed it. And I'll identify the people that I listen to as scholarly first and potentially religious second, but maybe not. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And I'll reference when I'm talking about a religious viewpoint. I'll try to keep that clear in this episode. A caveat to that, though, is that just because a Bible scholar is a scholar doesn't mean they're right and doesn't mean they can't change their minds later. Many of the scholars I've followed have changed their minds even within the last few years about things, and that's what I think is really interesting about the whole school of thought and school of study. When more info comes out, they change their minds, and a lot of times they don't even agree with each other. I'm going to talk about several things today that Bible scholars disagree with each other on, and it's usually friendly disagreement because at the end of the day, we all know that we don't know. We're just doing the best study we can. I mean, I'm not. I say we, but I'm going to say we a lot, but it's not we. I'm not doing it. I'm just listening to them. Apologists don't quite work the same way, and so I don't think that they are the same thing. They're not doing the same thing. So today's episode is going to have a couple different things going on. I'm mostly going to talk about textual criticisms, meaning scholars agree that the text says something, and they can assert that something was intended via their understanding of the text. The assertion would be something like, the text says this in a very literal way. Here's what that would have meant literally, or here's what it would have meant contextually, or linguistically. Maybe there's a turn of phrase involved, something like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. So that's one type of thing that I find interesting. Another thing I find interesting is historical assertions. Is the text historically accurate? Is the Bible reflecting other documents around the same time historically? Can it reflect those things? If the Bible is the only bit of history, does that mean it's history or not? Does the Bible agree with other historical documents? There's a lot of history out there. Some of it as old as the Bible. How do those things interact with each other? So, number one, textual criticisms. Number two, historical context criticisms. Those are probably the two main categories of thing that I'll talk about today. I probably won't get into intent a whole lot. There's a couple times I will, and I'll talk about that, but it's really hard to get intent from writers. There's a few places where, based on historical context or other documents for context, things like that, you can piece together intent pretty well. I'll talk about a couple of those examples, which are pretty interesting. But anytime I reference a change in my understanding of the meaning of something, usually it's historical or textual. Assumptions I won't make, univocality. That's a great word. It's one of my favorite new words, univocality. Basically that the Bible was breathed by God continuously all the way through. It's all inspired directly by God, so therefore it all tells the same story. I no longer think that's true. And if you do think that's true, I hope you still listen because I think you might find this interesting anyway, but I get if you won't. I get if you think that that's problematic in some way. I believe the Bible was written by different people at different times with different assumptions built in, different historical contexts, and different intents. So there's not one intent all the way through. I'm also not assuming inspiration, which kind of goes without saying. If you throw away univocality, you're probably throwing away godly inspiration as well. Maybe not throwing away, but not assuming it. It's possible. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just not assumed. And I'm not assuming historicity. This is a more important point than I maybe thought when I first started all of this. It's an important point because I grew up thinking that the Bible was basically historical and assumed so. So anything I read was something that happened. Now, as I got older, I looked more into it, and it's like, well, were Adam and Eve real people? Were they the first two people? Did Noah's flood happen? Did the Exodus happen? All this stuff. Of course, as we grow older and maybe more historically literate or biblically literate, we might change our views on these things. But for the sake of this episode, it's not assumed that the Bible is historically accurate. It's not assumed that it's not either. It's just assumed that this stuff was written down, and this episode will compare the historicity of the Bible to other things too. All right, is that enough throat clearing? That's a lot. That's like a whole episode of just throat clearing and caveats and trigger warnings and disclaimers. All right, I'm going to start talking about why I'm doing this. Okay, so as I mentioned, the reasoning behind this episode was that I wanted to learn more about the Bible and religion and things like that, and with the assumption that maybe other Christian denominations, or the broader church, as it were, church in quotes, the Christian church, had a better handle on the Bible than we had. And I did that. I learned about that. I've listened to a lot of apologists, and if you have a favorite apologist, I've probably heard them. If you have a favorite Bible scholar, I've probably heard them too, though, and I listened to both, and I realized there was a problem. I'm going to explain the problem, but I think a lot of you won't like it, so feel free to tap out at any time. The first thing I noticed was that across the board, evangelical Christians believe in the Trinity. And I had grown up thinking that only Catholics thought that. I don't know why I thought that. I don't know where that came from, but, well, I know where it came from is I just heard it somewhere and decided not to look into it anymore. And because, worldly churches, we don't want to look at those. They're bad. They're false doctrine, false preaching, whatever. So I just never learned more about them. And as I learned more about them, I realized they all say that. Evangelical Christianity believes that Jesus is God, God, Son, Holy Spirit are all one. And increasingly, I've noticed that they say things like, well, they make the insinuation that anybody who doesn't believe that is in a cult. There's a lot of big religions that don't believe that. The LDS faith doesn't, although they've changed their mind a few times. But I think their core doctrine is that the Trinity isn't true. Jehovah's Witnesses, same thing. At least that's how I understand it. And of course, professing people don't. It's spoken explicitly, and I've had a worker in my field say it, and we heard it at convention twice this year, that the Trinity is a worldly doctrine and it's bad. But then I started listening to Bible scholars, and that threw me for a loop because, as far as I could tell, Bible scholars say that's not in the Bible, that the Trinity is more of a post-biblical interpretation or an extrapolation or something like that. In fact, I've heard multiple biblical scholars call the Trinity an innovation. So I don't know what to do with that, or I didn't know what to do with that. I've decided what to do with it, but I wasn't sure what to do with that. So that was the first thing that I came up against, and immediately that shut down the podcast because I was like, wait a second. If I'm going to learn more about the Bible, but the religious world and the scholarly world have completely different takes on the Bible, then I got to pick one. So I just shelved the whole thing for a long time. But now that I have it back out, I'm just going to have to say that I'm going to pick the scholarly route on this one because it's more interesting to me, to be completely honest with you. I like listening to scholars. The conversations are really interesting, intriguing, gripping. But this is why this isn't part 2 of a podcast. This one had to sit for a while I thought about it. What started out as me learning more about evangelical Christianity turned into me listening to a lot of Bible scholars. I'll talk about these more at the end, but right now I listen to 5 different Bible scholarship podcasts weekly. I get them downloaded right to my phone. And mind you, I don't go to church. I don't consider myself religious, but I find the scholarship around the Bible really, really fascinating. The Bible is really important. It's a big part of our culture, increasingly so. And I have more to say about that later too, but our culture is so wrapped up in biblical iconography and sentiments around Christianity that it kind of matters what the Bible says. I'm not entirely sure it matters to a lot of religious people, even apologists. And that's why I've kind of abandoned that because I wasn't getting good information from them. And the Trinity is one of those things. It's such a weird topic to me because across the board, all evangelical Christians believe that the Trinity is a thing. Bible scholars, including apologists, say that it's not necessarily biblical. I realize I'm weeding out a lot of people here early on, and sorry about that, but this is just my experience. I've listened to hours of apologists talking about the Trinity, and I don't get it. I genuinely don't. I don't know where it's coming from. There are verses that suggest the Trinity for sure. There are verses that suggest it's not a thing. And of course, once you lose the idea that the Bible is univocal, then you kind of have to deal with the fact that there are contradictions. If you believe the Bible is inspired and univocal and is one continuous message, then you can't say that there are contradictions. You have to step away from those. And I don't have to do that anymore. I'm glad that I let go of that a long time ago because it helps me enjoy the Bible much more. Most recently, I heard, someone I referenced earlier, a scholar, quote unquote, who works for an organization called, something about apologists. He's truly an apologist. He brought up the verse, 1 John 5, 7 through 8. These verses are used often by apologists to say that the Bible reinforces the idea of the Trinity. And this scholar, who I don't even respect because I don't think he's truly a scholar, I think he's mostly an apologist, he actually said what all the scholars say, which is that those two verses aren't original to the Bible. They were added in way later. And his argument was that you don't need those verses, but those verses often are used for that type of apologetic. And his recommendation to a fellow apologist was to abandon those verses because they're not original to the Bible. So that's where I'm coming from here. The non-Trinitarian stance isn't a stance I'm taking. It's just a stance I'm noting that most scholars take. Most of this episode is going to be about where scholars, for the most part, agree. The vast majority agree. There are a few cases where there are major disagreements, but there's not that many. There are a lot of cases in the Bible where things are agreed upon 100% or nearly 100% across the board by serious Bible scholars in regards to things that I had no idea about. And that's probably what I'm going to talk about most today. The Trinity thing is super interesting to me just because it lays the groundwork for most of Christianity when most scholars say that it's not necessarily inherently a thing. That's not to say even some of them don't believe it. I think some do, actually, including the one I just talked about. But if you're just reading the Bible straightforward, it doesn't necessarily point to the Trinity. Anyway, now I don't care about that one too much personally, but I know a lot of people do, and that's why I wanted to bring it up right away. So if you wanted to bail, you can, if that kind of thing bothers you. But now you know where I'm coming from. The idea of biblical, quote unquote, doesn't mean much. Scholars often say, depends on what you mean by biblical, or depends on what you mean by the Bible. Biblical, canonical, inspired, all those things, all those words that people say when they're talking about the Bible to kind of sound smart, myself included, by the way. A lot of those words don't really mean anything in scholarship. The Bible has changed so much, and there's not really a core Bible or a core canon. The Bible is a collection, and it's what we all call the collection of books, but it's not the same thing the world over. Not everybody has the same Bible. In the United States, where I'm from, evangelical Christianity is tilted quite a bit toward the King James Version of the Bible, but no Bible scholar anywhere, even apologists, think the King James Version is a good translation. At best, it's a translation of a translation. But then again, what is the best translation? If you ask a Bible scholar, they all agree that it matters what you're trying to get out of it. When people ask what the best Bible translation is, what they're asking is what's correct. And that's not a thing. That's not an answer you can get from somebody who understands the Bible historically or scholastically. There are all kinds of different canons. A lot of people who've read or watched the Da Vinci Code think that the Bible came from the Council of Nicaea, but as far as I can tell, it didn't. It predated it, and it's been changed since. Even people who were at the Council of Nicaea believed that the Bible should look differently afterwards. And there's a lot of controversy around it. I learned that there have been books that have come and gone from the canon, quote unquote, things like the Gospel of Thomas, Book of Enoch. I learned that there's a Gospel of Jesus, or something like that. I forget what it's called. I learned that there's several books that were hotly debated and have always been. Things like the Book of Esther, Ecclesiastes, Revelation. I'm going to talk a lot about Revelation later because I think it's really interesting. Esther doesn't mention God at all, which is really funny. I didn't know that while I was professing. I've read Esther before too. And again, when you assume univocality of the Bible, you just read over facts like that. But a lot of people think that Esther shouldn't have been in the Bible, or a lot of people have thought that over the years because it doesn't talk about God. Esther wasn't in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot of people talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they don't talk about the fact that they don't agree with the Bible a lot of times. Words are different. There's some books there, some left out. Ecclesiastes has been hotly debated because people in the Christian tradition think that it's a weird book. Same with Revelation. One thing I never knew was that even Martin Luther had weird ideas about what the Bible should have in it. Of course, he was starting from a much larger Bible. He was starting, I believe, from a Catholic Bible, and I don't know if that Bible's changed a lot since then, but when he started getting the Bible distributed around, he removed Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation, and then a whole bunch of Catholic books, and put them all in an appendix. He liked Hebrews, James, Jude, Revelation, but he just didn't think they belonged in the Bible because he didn't think they jived with the message. Protestant Christians love to point back to Martin Luther as a hero for pulling Christians out of the Catholic Church, but I've never in my life heard that he had a Bible that didn't match ours at all. And he didn't even think that some of the books in our current Bible were worth keeping in the Bible, and he took them out. I learned things like Jeremiah and Isaiah having different versions out there depending on when the scrolls were discovered or when the texts were discovered. That's interesting. And another person that pops up among apologists is Josephus when he's talking about Christians, and he's used as proof of Christianity's truth a lot. I learned from scholars that in his writings, he referenced 13 books of prophets, and there's no collection anywhere that has 13 books of prophets. There are collections that have 8, there are collections that have over 20, but there's no combo that has 13. So Josephus may have had a Bible that we don't even know about. The style of the Bible has changed a lot. Obviously, the canon is all over the place, but versification, just breaking the Bible up into chapters and verses, is a relatively new thing. I don't remember when that was done, and I was going to look it up, and I forgot. And I'm not going to now. You can go look it up. But one of the artifacts of that is Psalms 9 and Psalm 10 used to be one book, and they were split into 2. And then Psalm 151 has been removed at some point. Psalm 151 is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not in any of our Bibles now. So one was removed, and another psalm was split into 2. And who knows why? I've noticed that a lot of apologetics are based on how the Bible is set up, like verse structure and chapter structure and things like that. And that's just not the Bible. That's our current Bible, but it hasn't always been that way. Sometimes these are just stories. They're just strings of text, and that's it. We've made them more readable over time, but that's not how the Bible's always been. Anyway, so that's kind of an intro. That's kind of intro 2 here. Now that I got the throat clearing out of the way and the general intro that got me excited to learn about the Bible, I'm going to talk next about individual things in the Bible that I learned that I never knew. Individual things, whether it's facts about the Bible, translation things, stuff like that. The only criteria here is that it's interesting to me and that the vast majority of scholars agree on it. I'll try to note places where one scholar or a couple scholars have said something that's maybe disagrees with the mainstream. But the vast majority of things I'm going to talk about are going to be agreed upon. But most of the things I talk about are going to be agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars. And that intrigues me. All right. I'm going to start at the beginning of the Bible, kind of. I'm going to work my way front to back. I'll probably have to skip around a little bit for certain things, but I'm going to try to start at the beginning. So in chronological order, the first interesting thing to me is actually in Job, because Job isn't the oldest book of the Bible after all. I thought it was. During my deconstruction especially, but sometimes before that, I had spent time reading the Bible beginning to end, but I had tried several times to read the Bible chronologically. And I would find lists online, or I would find even professing lists. Workers had passed out lists of the Bible written chronologically, and Job was always first. I've seen a couple scholars talking about the order of the Bible, and one thing that seems pretty common is that there are pieces of Genesis that actually predate Job, but not all of Genesis. Genesis seems to draw on stories from older myths or older books or something, older scrolls. And in some cases, as I understand it, it's nearly word for word, or at least phrase for phrase. Stories were imported fully into Genesis from other places, which implies that those stories are older than Genesis, which implies that they're older than Job in some cases. Because I think Job is fairly well dated. I'm not sure on that. But there are pieces of Genesis like poetry and some of the songs and things like that that show up long before any of the rest of the Bible. I should say, actually, before I get going through the Bible anymore, what I've learned about words, a lot of people learn this stuff right away, and I'll just touch on it really quickly because I meant to put this earlier, but words in the Bible don't always mean what I think we were raised thinking they meant. The words in the Bible are always up for interpretation. And I have a couple examples that I think are interesting and actually could potentially change people's theology if they accepted the alternate meanings. The first obvious one is hell. A lot of people note this one. I've looked into it a little bit, and I haven't come up with anything different than anybody can find. It's hell in the Bible. The word hell in the KJV can mean a lot of different things because the root word is completely different depending on where you find the word in the Bible. I'm not going to dig into this one too much because everyone does this, because everyone's interested in it. When you leave Christianity, or at least you leave a church, you look that one up first because you're like, well, where am I going if I get this wrong? Everything from Sheol in the Old Testament, which doesn't mean hell, there was no concept for hell in the Old Testament, as I understand it, to Gehenna in the New Testament. Those are both rendered, I should say, to use a scholarly term, as hell. But Sheol in the Old Testament was more like just gone, Hades or something, underground. Gehenna in the New Testament, I've heard a lot of people, even serious scholars, say they think it was just a garbage pit somewhere in Jerusalem or something like that. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I've seen people who've traveled to that area, the place that they thought was just like the garbage landfill thing that Jesus is referring to. To be fair, Jesus could have just been comparing a place where they burned garbage to how they would burn people in hell. I don't know. But anyway, hell isn't quite as literal. Another fun one is Ark. The Ark of the Covenant versus the Ark that Noah was on. It's funny that whoever rendered the Bible in KJV picked those two words because they don't come from the same root word. The Ark of the Covenant, Ark, is rendered from a word that, as far as I know, just means box. And of course, the other Ark was the boat. That's interesting. I don't know what to do with that other than it's just like, I wonder why they picked that word. It meant that something at the time. Of course, that's a major thing, right? When you realize that the Bible, when it was rendered, meant more to people at that time than it does to us now, in the sense that the words they're drawing on made more sense. And by the way, just a side thought on that, the KJV was considered outdated at the time that it was first made. I've heard that many, many times over, that the King James Version wasn't popular when it first came out because people thought that it was outdated and the words weren't used well. So do with that what you will. I think there's a really interesting example of how words get parsed. Deuteronomy 32:9 talks about, well, it depends which Bible you read and how old the Bibles are. It talks of sons of God, angels of God, sons of Israel, or a few other things, depending on how old the Bible is you're reading. This leads to another topic, which is how is God referred to in the Bible? Once you get into scholarship, there's a completely different language around what does God mean. There's lots of different words that are rendered as God, and there are lots of words rendered as Lord. Some religions base their conception of God on the fact that the words have been rendered a certain way or whatever. Jehovah's Witnesses do that quite a bit because they clued into the fact that a lot of times the tetragrammaton, which is how people refer to the God's name, has been changed to Lord many times. So that's why they made their own Bible, which just uses the tetragrammaton. When I say tetragrammaton, I say that so you can Google it. It's just the 4 symbols that make God's name. And so, there's a whole religion based around the fact that they want to undo that. Sometimes in the Bible, older texts use the phrase Elohim. And I saw the most interesting thing in a Christian social media group the other day, talking about how, well, as we all know by now, Christians really like gender to be simple. And it's not, but they like it to be so. And to the point that a lot of Christians have gone to the Bible to point out that gender is very, very simple in the Bible and God made us a certain way. And if you look at the original text of the Bible or older texts of the Bible, I have a hard time with original because we never know where some of these things started, right? We don't know how far to go back, but the oldest texts that we have different words that are not as obviously gendered for God. Many times it's plural. I saw something in a social media group recently that said God is not plural. It's never plural. It's never they. And it's demons say they. The demons are the ones that say they, implying that you should, be really mean to people who use gender neutral pronouns. That's stupid. And those people need to get better hobbies because that's not true. They need to get better hobbies because it's mean and mean-spirited and bigoted, but it's also just not true. The word Elohim in the Old Testament can mean singular or plural depending on how it's used, and it is used both ways as I understand it. Some of the books in the Old Testament use plurals for God a lot, and that can mean a lot of different things, to the point that scholars oftentimes talk about the divine council just meaning a bunch of gods, a bunch of people who are, well, not people, a bunch of godlike figures that get together and talk about things. This is obvious, even in the KJV, this is obvious in Job. It's pretty obvious in Genesis too, Genesis also, sorry, not 2, also Genesis. When you read through, it often says we for God. Now, of course, Christian apologists will say we means God and Jesus or God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, something like that. But I feel like that actually undercuts the Trinity argument when you say we for something that you're arguing is singular. But I don't know. That's up to you. And again, I don't care. I don't care about the religious ramifications anymore. I just think that the linguistic ramifications are super interesting. Christian apologists trying to squeeze God into male, masculine pronouns always tips me off that they're not a serious scholar, because serious scholars, even apologists, even believing scholars, wouldn't do that because they know that's not accurate. But I'll move along from that. I could talk about that for a while. Maybe I'll do a whole episode on that sometime. Most of the Old Testament big names are mythological or composites, according to scholars and historians. I recently saw one scholar say that there are no verifiable historical figures in the first 5 books of the Bible. And someone actually had asked this person on social media who the first real character was that we know for sure. I mean, of course, any of them could be on some level, right? They could be real people or based on real people. They were specifically asking about Moses, I think. This scholar said as far as he knew, the first one was a pharaoh named Shishak. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but this person shows up in 1 Kings 14:25 and then 2 Chronicles 12, verses 1 through 12, I believe. That's how I have it written down, but I can't remember if that's right. Anyway, that's kind of cool to know. It's cool to know that there were historical figures that were really historical figures, but also a lot of them might not have been. A lot of people ask about the main characters of the Old Testament. They ask scholars like, is Moses real? Is David real? Is, et cetera, et cetera. I've heard multiple times that the Davidic dynasty, so the kingdom as run by David, was real. So David probably was real. But there's almost nothing about him that can be verified. Even in the Bible, there's a couple contradictions within the Bible about even things that we just completely believe and never even talk about or question, like David killing Goliath. There's another spot, and I can't remember where. I'm not going to list all the verses for this stuff. I'm going to skip around a little bit, and you can just look the stuff up yourself if you're interested. But there's another person named Elhanan who gets credit for killing Goliath too. So it's hard to tell what happened there, whether David was credited in one place for doing something somebody else did or what. There's a really quirky, but I think believable theory put forward by some scholars that David was a king and was real, but most of the stories were made up to push him forward politically, to make him sound like a great king so that people would want him, so that they could tell stories about him and sing songs about him and make people get really excited about him so that they would follow him. When you look at it that way, that makes a ton of sense. Fighting a lion, killing a giant, maybe stealing credit from that, we're not sure. There's all kinds of things that David does that sound pretty wild, and who knows, maybe they happened. But if they didn't, that actually makes just as much sense. Okay, so that's all I want to say about individual people. The idea that Moses probably wasn't a real person. Actually, I'm going to come back to that in a second because I have something to say about Exodus. Let's see, back to Genesis. There's something really obvious in Genesis that I read past because, of course, I believe the Bible is univocal. I believe the Bible is one continuous story as a 2x2. And now when I look back, it's like, I cannot believe I didn't question this more. And that is, why is the creation story told twice? Why is the Noah story told twice? There's a handful of stories in the Old Testament that anybody would point out as major keystone stories in a book. Several of them are told twice, and they're different both times. This actually happens a lot in the Bible. The stories are retold several times, sometimes right next to each other. I talked about versification and splitting up of chapters and stuff. That happened in Genesis. Genesis 1, and then the first few verses of chapter 2, I think it's the first 4 verses, are considered to have come from one source. And then after that, the story starts over again, but different, in a different order. The creation order is even different. Bible scholars have no problem saying that was a completely different author. And not only that, they believe that there's a handful of different authors throughout Genesis, that these are composite stories. And they have names for them and everything. This is Biblical Scholarship 101, by the way. This isn't even in-depth knowledge. This is what you would learn in your first Bible class. This isn't even deep cuts here. This is Bible class 101. This is the first thing you'd learn on day 1 of Bible scholarship class, whether it's a believing school or not, whether it's just for scholarship or whether it's for people learning to become priests or whatever. You learn right away that Genesis is a composite of several different sources, and that's why it keeps repeating stories. It's such an obvious thing, but I didn't notice it when I was professing. Or I did, but I just thought must be a reason, right? There's always a reason. Everything happens for a reason. Okay, I was going to talk about Exodus. This is shocking what I learned about Exodus. It is universally agreed among every single scholar I've ever looked at that the Exodus didn't happen. I knew atheists thought this, and I knew atheists would always point to, like, where's the evidence? How could they walk around, for 40 years, this many people, without leaving any sort of trace? Or, where did all these people sleep at night? Where did they, relieve themselves? How did they feed themselves? All this stuff. There's lots of tactical reasons why the Exodus doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's a good story. And with God, all things are possible, right? I have not found a single Bible scholar, believing or not, apologist or not, who thinks the Exodus happened. And that kind of blows me away. I always thought that was just something that people said to mess with other people's faith, but turns out they all say that. Let's see, what else is... Okay, so the Ten Commandments. This is another one, and this is one... There's actually a couple things that I learned, but was more confirming to learn them than surprising. Exodus not happening surprised me. This didn't surprise me at all. When you say Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments have been politicized beyond all reason at this point. It's ridiculous how people talk about them. Part of why it's ridiculous is because there aren't 10. And every time a set of commandments comes up, it's just a bunch of verses in a row, and somehow people have turned it into 10. And I can't figure that one out. Bible scholars across the board say it doesn't matter how you chop up the old language, it doesn't come out to 10 commandments. There is a list of 10 rules somewhere that's even referred to that way a little bit. And I can't remember where it is, but it's not the list that politicians want to put in classrooms to make kids behave or put in front of courtrooms so people know what the laws are. It drives me crazy how much the Bible's been politicized. That's for another time, but the Ten Commandment thing is very strange. And across the board, Bible scholars will agree that there's not really 10 commandments. That's not really a thing. It's really hard to parse them up into 10. And the way people have done it is usually for political purposes. And I'm going to leave that alone for now. Other than to say, if anyone tells you that the Ten Commandments are important in their life, ask them to name 3. All right. I mentioned Psalms earlier. I think I already talked about this. They were next in my notes, but the 151st Psalm being removed at some point because it doesn't read like the rest of the Psalms. I've never read it myself. I've heard somebody read it. I heard somebody read it in a podcast once, but it's never included anywhere in Bibles in the United States. It is in other Bibles. It was in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But, the Dead Sea Scrolls are pretty recent, and we care about them a lot when they match the KJV Bible, and not so much other times. Let's see, I mentioned Psalms 9 and 10 already. Yeah, nobody knows why those were separated, other than it just rounded out to 150, and that's a nice number. I don't know. Deutero-Isaiah, that's a fun term. It shows up a lot. It just means Isaiah was written by more than one person. The book of Isaiah is actually 2 books, and not only are they not written by the same person, they weren't written in the same century. Scholars estimate that the beginning of Isaiah doesn't match the middle of Isaiah by about 200 years. I don't remember which 200 years, but there's a gap. And the reason they think there's a gap is because the language changes a lot in source texts for them, and references to events change a lot too. The same events historically are referenced later in the book don't match the references at the beginning of the book. And I don't have any more detail than that, but I've heard it a couple times, so I thought I'd throw it on here. Let's see, what else do I have? Okay, the other things I have in the Old Testament are Daniel and Jeremiah. Daniel is fun to learn about. There are a lot of people who've done like master's theses on Daniel, trying to figure out where it came from, who wrote it, and what it means. Apparently, for people who know history, the end of Daniel is fairly historically accurate. The beginning is not. As if it was written so much later that the people who were writing it, or person who wrote it, was familiar with recent history, not so much older history. As if it was written all at once, but much later than people thought. I think that's pretty intriguing to notice that history doesn't always match what's in the Bible, but sometimes it does. And that's weird. I don't know how to grapple with that. I'm not sure how I would grapple with that as a professing person because, again, it has to be true. But if it's kind of true sometimes, I don't know what to do with that. If it's never true, or if it's just approximations or sounds like myths or parables, I would just believe it that way. But we believe that it was completely true and historical. So when it's historical some of the time and way off other times, that's confusing. Jeremiah has some similar stuff. I don't remember. I wrote down Jeremiah in my notes here. I don't remember what all about it was interesting, other than that the language of it doesn't match the time period it's talking about. The original texts, or the oldest texts that can be found for Jeremiah, I believe are written in Greek, which is way, way, way later than the rest of the Old Testament. And people talk about Jeremiah and Daniel as forgeries. And if you just Google Daniel forgery, you'll find papers about it. People have put a lot of time into figuring out what in the world Daniel was for, if not to just convince people of something, to write a story that matched a narrative. I think a lot of the Old Testament is for narratives. I think it's to develop narrative around, why the people were who they were, why they believed what they believed, why the stories they told about themselves were important. And that doesn't need to be true to do that. We see that now in mythology that we teach ourselves all the time, or in storytelling that we do now. I talked about that in a 2x2 storytelling episode. The stories don't have to be true. They have to be compelling, and they have to get us where the storyteller wants to get us. And it has to transport us to a new place. The story can be compelling, but the story itself doesn't have to be true. That's not important. It can be true on a meta level, but factually, it doesn't necessarily need to be true. And I would argue that from a scholarly standpoint, that looks like most of the Old Testament, and maybe a lot of the New Testament as well. It wasn't meant to be history. It was meant to be a story. And they didn't have Barnes & Noble back then to separate out the truth from the myth, the fiction from the nonfiction. It was all just written down stories. A lot of it was oral and told to people. And so a lot of these stories predate the writing of them, the earliest writings, by generations probably. Anyway, so that's what I found interesting about the Old Testament. Okay, so up until this point, I've been talking about the Old Testament and things I've learned about the Old Testament that I did not know prior to leaving meetings. I think a lot of people don't know much about the Old Testament. I think there are people who are interested in Bible history, but assumptions about univocality, which I've talked about previously, or inspiration, things like that. I think those cloud ability to learn about the Bible. That's just my opinion. I think that would be true for myself. I can't imagine learning about Bible history and Bible scholarship as a believing, professing person, especially, because to learn about it is to set aside assumptions that make it not what we thought it was, which is a continuous narrative breathed straight from God through inspired hands. I think the Old Testament as a historical document is really interesting. I think of the Old Testament as a document of historical significance, not a history document, but a document of history, a document that compiles a lot of historical things of historical import. I also learned that a lot of scholars refer to the Old Testament as the Hebrew Bible too, and I don't know if that includes the whole KJV Old Testament, but when you hear the phrase Hebrew Bible, they're usually just referring to the Old Testament. I don't know exactly why they use that phrasing per se, but it's just something they say. Anyway, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the New Testament. The New Testament is kind of fun because you have historical scholarship about it, but you also have commentary from people who experienced the early church. And so there's scholarly commentary, and then there's also early church commentary. Some people like to talk about the church fathers or the early church, things like that. I won't talk about any of those people necessarily, although some names might come up. I'll see as I go through my notes here. But sometimes our assumptions about the early church come from those early texts, which may or may not be accurate because we've learned more since then. So, so I'll just start working my way through the Gospels first, of course. I never knew about the chronological ordering of the Gospels. I always thought of them as kind of being written around the same time, give or take. For some reason, I had in my mind that they were not too long after Jesus died. So I kind of thought, for some reason, I have no idea where I came up with this, but I thought that they were maybe 20 or 30 years after Jesus died. I thought somebody wrote those Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I definitely thought 4 people wrote those Gospels. I don't think that anymore, so I'm going to talk about it. Universally, Bible scholars see Mark as the first one. And this is where I would talk about early church fathers. Again, I don't know exactly who I'm talking about, but I hear this brought up a lot, where people in the early church thought Matthew was first, and that might be why it's listed first in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, then John. But scholars across the board think that Mark was the first one to be written. It was probably written about 70 AD. Real quick, quick sidebar, actually. This doesn't really belong anywhere in this. There's not a chronological thing here. But I heard a Bible scholar one time talking about 70. Okay, this has nothing to do with Mark being written in 70 AD. I'll come back to that in a second. But I just realized I forgot to write something down, and this is super interesting. Okay, so there's this Bible scholar I follow who says that 70 and 40 are significant numbers, just in the sense that in the Bible, when they were written, they probably didn't mean literally 70 or 40. They sort of meant a lot. So like nowadays, sometimes we'll just exaggerate things. There will be some hyperbole when we don't know a number. We'll say like, oh, there's a ton of them, or oh, there's a million, something like that. I've heard this one Bible scholar, and again, this is just one guy, so I don't know how accurate this is, but there's one Bible scholar who says that 70 didn't actually literally mean 70, and it may have been true of 40 as well, that those are just sort of phrases they would say, like, oh, 70 times, meaning tons, a million, lots, heaps, something like that. So when Jesus said something like 70 times 7, somebody asked him if you should forgive 7 times, and he said 70 times 7. That actually makes more sense that way, because if they came to him and said, should we forgive 7 times? And he was like, a million times 7, that means there's no limit to it, right? But when he says 70 times 7, it comes up with a specific number that makes a specific number, and that's weird, right? So the idea that 70 just meant lots kind of makes sense. Same with 40. 40 is used a lot. 40 is used in the Old Testament. Noah was floating for 40 days in one telling of the story, not in the other one. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. Lots of 40s in the Bible. And again, from what I understand from just one source, 40 and 70 were just random numbers. They were just filler numbers, essentially. Okay, just thought I'd bring that up because it's interesting. I don't know how valid that is, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Numbers are a funny thing in the Bible, and I don't like putting too much weight into numbers and their significance, but there's a couple cases where they are important, and that might be one of them. I'm not sure. Okay, so back to Mark. Early church fathers thought Matthew was first, but now scholars think Mark is first. And there's a handful of reasons why this is true. There's whole videos online where scholars explain why they think Mark is the first gospel, the first one to be written. They say it's the first one written that we still have. Some believe there's another gospel, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, because that's kind of that'll be in a little section I talk about disagreements. But it's interesting to read Mark as the first gospel, because again, when I was reading the gospels when I was younger, I never thought about them having different stories in them. I just kind of thought they were all the same. But when you read them in order that they were written, you can see pretty significant differences. You'll notice that the stories build as they go. Mark was written probably about 70 AD, so 40 years after Jesus, give or take. It's the shortest, and seems like it may have been the source for the others to some degree, at least for Matthew and Luke. John's kind of a different thing, but Mark doesn't have a virgin birth and doesn't have a resurrection. That's interesting. The fact that the first writings of Jesus that we have recorded, that we still have, didn't include Mary being a virgin and didn't include a resurrection. I don't know what to do with that. That's interesting. That's thought-provoking, I would say. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier, there's lots of words that were translated different ways. There's a lot about this online, but virgin doesn't necessarily mean virgin. That's one of those things that people find right away when they start looking through the Bible and scholarship and stuff, when they leave religion or transition between religions. And I'm not going to dig into that at all, because some people say it still does mean that. A lot of people say it doesn't. A lot of people feel like Mary wasn't necessarily even portrayed as a virgin early on, but over time that has changed. So whatever, you can think whatever you want of that. Back to Mark, though. The reason I was talking about the resurrection is that universally among all Bible scholars that I can find, Everyone says Mark has a second ending that was added later. And that's what we have in the KJV Bible right now. So Mark 16, verses 9 through 20 are pretty much universally seen as added later. And I haven't found any scholars that I think of as honest scholars who don't think that. The earliest, most reliable manuscripts of Mark end in verse 8. Well, verses 9 through 20 are a big deal. And especially if you're professing, that second charge that Jesus gives his disciples is a pretty big deal. But also, it changes the narrative a lot about Jesus with the resurrection. Like I mentioned, there was no resurrection originally in Mark. The book just ended with women fleeing. And to change that story by adding that second ending is pretty significant. It's a pretty significant change in how one would read Mark, especially knowing that it's the first telling of Jesus. So Mark is the first gospel, but has essentially two endings. It has an ending that everyone accepts that goes back to the oldest manuscripts available. And then it has a few extra verses added onto the end that make it round out and act more like the other gospels, at least Matthew and Luke. Again, intriguing because it's universal. I haven't found any Bible scholars who disagree with that, and that's pretty wild. So this adds importance to Matthew and Luke and John. Matthew is commonly thought to have been written a few years later, about 80 to 90 CE. So maybe 50, 60 years after Jesus died. Matthew does include the resurrection. So what this means is that the first recorded telling of the resurrection story wasn't until quite a bit after Jesus' death. 50, 60 years later, probably. Pretty wild. I don't know what to think of that. So I'm just going to leave that there. You can think about that. Again, Mark written first, but universally seen as having the resurrection story added in to the end. I don't have much to say about Luke because Luke copies a lot of Mark as well. I'll come back and talk about those three a little bit later because I have some thoughts about that. The Gospel of John was written way later, and that number keeps moving back farther and farther. Most scholars have thought it's about 80 or 90 CE, but there are people who study John, the Gospel of John, and Johannine writings of John's. They believe that it was probably 100 to maybe even 120 CE. So we're talking 80 or 90 years after the death of Jesus. Pretty wild, actually. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of Bible books that have proven controversial over time, going all the way back to the original people assembling different versions of the Bible. John's actually one of them because it's so out of left field. It doesn't really read like the other three. But early church fathers liked it and thought it was made for a complete canon, so they kept it. As far as the Gospels themselves, timelines are all over the place, and they are not historical at all. Again, fairly universally understood or agreed upon by scholars. I think it's kind of interesting that Jesus was not born in year zero. I've always just assumed year zero was pretty well established. It's not. Most people believe Jesus existed. I'll start there. I think that's a good place to start. I think most people believe there was a historical Jesus. So even people who don't believe at all, even people who are atheist and don't believe any sort of Christian religion stuff, believe there was a Jesus. But no one really believes he was born year zero. Probably a little bit later, probably year 3 or so. The backdating just wasn't that good, according to scholars. And no matter how you look at it, none of the events in the Bible line up with historical events at all. The king killing all the babies, that didn't happen, probably. I don't think anyone really thinks that happened. None of the kings really line up. If you look at the kings who were king around that time, historically they don't line up. And again, the New Testament has more backing data. The Old Testament, you just have these old stories of Moses, which are probably just composites, it's just people telling stories about a person or whatever. The New Testament, there is historical documents around these times. Not a lot, but some. There's corroborating evidence for a lot of these things, and they don't line up with the Bible a lot of times. I don't know much about those things, so I'm sure someone could argue with me on that, but I'm not interested in that argument, so carry on. In one of the tellings of Jesus, it says that his family had to go home to pay a tax. That didn't happen at all. No one believes that either. I haven't seen a single person, believing or not, who thinks that was a real thing. The idea that you'd have to travel someplace to pay a tax just isn't really a thing, historically anyway. Again, you could say that, records weren't that good and they had to do it for some local thing or whatever. They had to go do it for their local municipality, but it wasn't a common thing, that's for sure, and not like that. There were taxes, but they wouldn't have happened around the time that Jesus was born, at least the ones we know about. There's always blank space of things we don't know about, but, things we do know about don't line up. Okay, so looking into the Gospels a little bit, I don't plan on reading many verses, but I'm going to point out a bunch of them because I'm kind of blown away by this. There are a lot of verses that have been taken out of recent copies of the Bible, and people freak out about them. If you go on TikTok or, Instagram Reels or whatever your favorite short-term memory social media thing is, people will be reading through their Bibles and they'll see that a verse has been taken out and they'll freak out about it and they'll say, hey, they're trying to take away our belief or whatever. There's always the they, them somewhere. They are trying to ruin your Christian belief. This has been done because those verses did not originate in the Bible. They were added later, and as more old copies are found, more old documents, more old scrolls, as people go through these old inscriptions and things, they're finding older and older copies of texts, and these verses just aren't in them. They've been added later, probably by a scribe. A lot of people believe that scribes just sometimes added stuff. And I thought this was kind of interesting. Somebody was talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I can't remember where this was. I wish I would have written this down. I just saw it on a video or heard about it. I think I heard about it as I was commuting or something, like on a podcast or something. But there's this verse in the Dead Sea Scrolls that, actually this verse in the Bible, a lot of people don't think it should be there. They think it was added by a scribe or something. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were uncovered, they found that exact verse written in between the lines on the Dead Sea Scroll, as if a scribe had edited it in there too, which is really wild to think about. I don't know why more people don't talk about stuff like that. I think that's just incredibly interesting. But anyway, there are a lot of verses that are currently being taken out of Bibles because older manuscripts don't have them. They were added by somebody. I wrote down a few examples from just one TikTok video that I saw more recently. I think there's more. I think there's at least 16 in the New Testament from what I've heard. The 7, right now I'm just going to say the 7 that were on the most recent video I saw. You can go look for more if you want. Matthew 17:21, Matthew 18:11, Matthew 23:14, Mark 7:16, Mark 11:26, John 5:4, and Romans 16:24. Those are the ones that you see people trip up on the most because they open their Bibles and they don't see those verses. They'll see that it skips from Mark 17:20 to Mark 17:22. And they'll say, hey, what's happening here? Well, it's because those verses just don't really belong in there because they don't show up in the oldest manuscripts. These verses are all in the KJV. I went and just checked those 7 and they're all in the KJV. So that's really wild, right? To realize that verses that I believed were breathed by God probably weren't even in the original manuscripts, or at least not in the oldest ones we have now, but they were added to kind of make the stories flow or whatever. Let's see. Oh yeah, I mentioned that Mark had an ending that was added. People think that might be true about the last chapter of John too. I don't know much about that. Actually, I'll talk more about John in a second. Luke 1 and 2, a lot of people think that the first 2 chapters of Luke were added later too. I don't know why they think that, and there's a lot of dispute around that. There's people who have made careers on that, and then there are other people who completely disagree with them on that. I don't know what's going on with that. So I wanted to bring that up because I think it's interesting. So now we have, John, Luke, and Mark. 3 of the 4 Gospels have disputed sections in them, not just a verse here and there. Matthew's got a few verses too, but entire sections that people think probably don't belong in there because they don't make any sense historically. John is an interesting book because it's just written differently. The vibe is different for a lot of different reasons. You can go Google that if that's interesting to you. Another heavily disputed thing, so not an agreement among scholars, but there are a handful of scholars who believe this, believe that all the John books, so the Gospel of John and then the letters from John, were written by what this person calls a Johannine community. I heard somebody recently talking about a Johannine community, meaning it was probably a group of scribes that got together and did it and just called themselves whatever turned into John. Again, heavily disputed, I think it's more of just a theory than it is anything anybody has proof about, but I don't know. I find that kind of intriguing as a concept. The fact that Gospels are named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John seems weird anyway, right? I mean, it seems like they would be named something else, especially since they don't really refer to themselves that way. Anyway, so that's all I had written about the Gospels. Another thing that I thought was interesting is that all scholars across the board believe that Paul didn't write all that. Some of it he may have written. I don't know how they tell which, but they believe he wrote some of it. They believe he had other people writing under his name, maybe just using his name. Whether it was somebody who knew him personally or not, hard to even tell. But there's a lot of style variance. There's a lot of words that only show up in certain books and not in other books, or turns of phrase, things like that. The inconsistencies are notable, and if they didn't say they were written by Paul, no one would even assume that they were the same person. And this explains a lot, actually. It explains why even Paul's take on Christian doctrine are so different. There's a lot of people out there, even among Christians, I would say, who think of Christianity as less about Christ and more about the teachings of Paul. You know, when you ask Christians about their belief system, usually they start telling you stuff about Paul. Because if they had to just talk about Jesus, they'd have to be nice. And Paul is the one that gives you license to be mean to people. And I think a lot of believers like that. Paul has really inconsistent doctrinal stances, I would say. And I've always wondered about that, but that's always hand-waved away by 2x2s and by Christians at large as being related to who he was writing to, especially around things like women. So in one place, he'll say women shouldn't talk in the church. And in another place, he'll say this woman is helping him in the gospel. And rather than just say this needs to be squared somehow, people just say, well, he was talking to different people, different time, whatever. There's these contextual things that people want to see. Christians want to see the Bible as univocal until it's not. And then there's a way to explain it away, which is really funny to me. It's like, well, if you're going to explain it away that way, then why wouldn't you do that in other cases? But I don't know. That's just me talking. Women in the Bible is such a wild topic because there's really a vein of Christianity right now that really wants to diminish women. And Paul makes it tough because even though he told women not to speak in one place or not to preach or not to teach or whatever, there's all kinds of bending of words around those verses to make sure that women know their place in the Christian communities. But in other places, he speaks highly of women. And so it's like, well, how do you do that? How do you deal with that? What do you do with that? Turns out you just change the Bible. In Romans 16:7, Paul refers to a co-laborer named Eunia. There is so much time and effort spent on Eunia. It blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind. Because I'm struggling with Christianity a lot right now for reasons just like this one. It's pretty clear if you just read the text that Eunia is some kind of something, apostle, disciple, whatever you want to call it, person who's preaching with Paul. But certain subsets of Christianity really, really don't want women to have any power, and they don't know what to do with that. So I have seen so many videos on YouTube of Christians explaining away that Eunia wasn't really that special. I mean, we're talking like half-hour, hour videos of apologists sitting there trying really hard to make Eunia not matter. It's so strange because it's a name that I probably read past 100 times in my life or more, hundreds maybe. And I never really thought about it because, you know, professing people have sister workers. We have women preachers. But a lot of Christendom doesn't think you should have women with any power, or you shouldn't listen to them talk, or you shouldn't listen to them preach or teach. They can teach, but they can't preach, or they can testify, but they can't blah, 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 blah. They just pull out all these words. It's dumb. At the end of the day, they're just trying to keep women quiet and keep women in their place. That's what I think of it. The amount of time spent on Unia as an issue is shocking to me. There are versions of the Bible out there that have replaced Unia with the name Unius to make it sound more masculine. Apologetic arguments around stuff like this are just stupid, in my opinion. I'm sorry, I have to editorialize here a lot. This is dumb. This is a waste of everyone's time, but it's very telling. And when people leave Christianity, it's because of stuff like this, because people who claim to follow Jesus in love spend a lot of time trying to make the Bible say something they really want it to say. Scholars pretty much agree that Unia is the original name because it makes sense in the original language. Unius does not make any sense. Given the language that we believe the writings of Paul were originally in, Unius doesn't make sense culturally. It just doesn't, the name just doesn't show up anywhere. It does exist. It shows up years later in something else, like a lot later, like 100 years later or something. I don't know. I could be wrong about that. I might be exaggerating that a little bit, but Unius just in no way makes any sense. But again, people who really, really want women to be held down and kept separate will quite literally try to read this into the Bible, and in some cases have just changed the name to something more masculine sounding so they don't have to deal with it. Evangelicals really, really don't want a female apostle. It's really important to them not to have one. And they'll make the Bible say that. So much of religion is making God in our own image. Anyway, I've learned a few terms that real serious religious Christians use. Things like the 5 solas or solus or whatever. One of them being sola scriptura, that scripture alone is meaningful or whatever. Scripture alone is whatever. I don't even know why they say it, because there's 5 of them. Each one is that thing alone. So I don't know how you have 5 things uniquely alone, but the sola scriptura people are really into the Bible is the word of God. We don't need anything else. We just need the Bible. We just read it and we know it. And those people tend to change the Bible a lot. It's weird. They don't seem to see any irony in that, and I don't know what to tell them. This is part of why, as I was learning about the Bible, I just stopped looking at apologists for answers to things, because I feel like I see that a lot among apologists. Scholars tell you what the Bible means and says in context as best they can, not from a theological sense, but from a very literal, pragmatic sense. Apologists do the theology part, and that's fine, but sometimes that apology comes up against the literal part, and they'll just make something up. And when you're just doing this just to disempower women, I think you're a jerk, and I'm not going to listen to you anymore. All right, so the end of the New Testament, of course, includes Revelation. Revelation is chaos, and we all know that. We have a hard time reading it. Even when we were professing 2x2s, it was just difficult to read, and it's hard to know what meaning to get out of a lot of it, and hard to know what was real in it, what's mythological or a parable. But I learned something about it that it's actually not something I learned. It's something that has been confirmed that kind of blows my mind, and that is the mark of the beast being 666. I've actually heard in other places, in other languages, in other manuscripts, the number comes out to be 616. I never knew why that was, and I kind of shelved that idea because it's like, whatever, it's, old languages, who knows? It meant something to them. I've also heard from various people that 666 and or 616 means that it was some allusion to Nero, the historical Nero that persecuted the church. I am blown away to find out that that might be true. I didn't think there was any way. I thought that was people making stuff up. Apparently, 666 in the original manuscript, if you use the numbers and add them up and use gematria, you come out with Nero. 616 is written in a different language, and that does too. That also comes out to Nero. And so scholars think, that that's what they were referring to, that they were actually referring to Nero, that he was the beast that was, hassling him or whatever. Even Christian scholars who believe the Bible, have said this, and it blows my mind. I had no idea. I think gematria is stupid, usually. People who are conspiracy theorists and real wacko end of the conspiracy theorist realm often bring up gematria to explain things. And I think it's one of the dumbest pattern matching techniques you could possibly have. So when I heard it about Nero being 666 in the Bible, I just blew it off immediately. And this was years ago I heard about this, and I heard somebody bring it up or mention it or whatever. I don't know how I heard about it. And I just thought, that's dumb. What a dumb thing. Like, the Bible is so full of stuff and rich in meaning, and you're going to do gematria with a number in the Bible? And I hear it brought up all the time. Bible scholars believe that's exactly what they were referring to, that the writers were referring to Nero. I think that's one of the most fascinating things I've learned, actually. One of the more significant things I learned in all of this was that Revelation wasn't popular originally. A few people liked it. Most people didn't. At least anecdotally, that's what I've learned from Bible scholars that understand the history of the time and have read a lot of the texts around the Bible at that time. There was a guy named Athanasius who really liked the Revelation, and most other people didn't. Athanasius was actually at Nicaea, I believe, at the Council of Nicaea. So I don't know if he just didn't convince them or what, but later in his life, he started having prints of the Bible made, the canon at that time. And I don't know what all was in it, but he added Revelation. And that was the first time it had really been produced at any sort of scale, including Revelation. I don't know much about Athanasius, but he's considered one of the early church fathers, quote unquote, and he was a big proponent of Peter's writings and the Revelation. So even though a lot of people at the time didn't think Revelation should have been part of the Bible, he liked it and he wanted it included. A lot of people didn't like the Revelation because they thought it just didn't vibe with the rest of the Bible and thought it was weird. He liked it, and so he included it. And if I understand this right, this was the first time the Revelation was included in any sort of Bible canon. And that was like 300 something CE. Hundreds of years after Jesus lived and died, the Revelation was included in canon. And that's interesting to me because, first of all, just the idea that a lot of people didn't like it and thought it was weird, and it is. Second of all, that it was so much later that this book was added to canon and sort of incorporated into the Bible. A lot of Christianity today is based on being really scared of Revelation, including 2x2 culture. 2x2 culture is a constant concern about what if the Revelation comes true all of a sudden. We never say things like the rapture, but, we worry about Revelation all the time. We worry about everything in there, even though we don't understand any of it. We kind of avoid it or kind of read about it now and then, and every once in a while an older brother worker will think that he understands it, and so he'll start talking about it. But it's pretty interesting to me to learn that a lot of people just didn't like the book at all to start with, and one guy is sort of credited with including it in canon. And the rest is history. Okay, so I have two more little items that I learned about in the Bible. And one of them is the most surprising, and one is the least surprising. What should I do first? I'm going to start with the least surprising, I think. The least surprising thing I learned was one of the first things I learned because I looked it up. When I left meetings and was contemplating learning more about the Bible, this is the first thing I looked up, and I knew it. I was right all along. The camel through the eye of the needle thing does not refer to a gate. Workers have talked about that for a long time. So many workers have talked about the camel through the eye of the needle, saying that the eye of the needle is like a euphemism or a parable or a nickname or something, referring to a small gate in the side of the city of Jerusalem. And so the camel, to get through this gate, it has to get down on its knees and shuffle through. And of course, the story here is that somebody said to Jesus, is it hard for the rich to be saved? And he said it's easier for the camel to get through the eye of a needle. And so the worker teaching is, it can be done, but you have to do it on your knees. That's nonsense. And I would accuse them of making it up, but I've heard that also in evangelical circles, that exact analogy, and it's not true. There's no eye of a needle gate. As far as I know, that's completely made up. I don't know if it's a prosperity gospel teaching or what. The idea that you would take something about riches and pretend that it says the opposite or pretend that it doesn't matter just because vibes, I don't know. It seems nefarious. But I always, when I was professing, I remember looking at that verse thinking, where are they getting that? Where are they getting that that's a gate? Because if the eye of the needle was the name of a gate, Wouldn't it be capitalized or something? How wouldn't they tell you in some way that this was the name of something? It would be denoted in some way to tell you it's a gate. But of course, I just let it go. Well, I started looking it up, and another thing universally agreed upon among Bible scholars is that that's not real. And they are all tired of you asking about it. Because people really want to justify having lots of riches if they can just be on their knees a little bit. Do what you want with that. That was the least surprising thing I learned. I guessed it and I was right. Okay, now, the number one most surprising thing that I learned. It's most surprising because of the significance of it, of this change. And it's also surprising because the most apologetic people that I can find agree that it's true. And it blows my mind that this is true. And that is, the story of the woman taken in adultery is a late add. It doesn't go back very far with copies of the Bible. It's a very recent addition. And very recent, I mean, hundreds of years still. But the story of the woman who came to Jesus, who was brought to her because she'd been caught committing adultery, and Jesus told the people who had brought her that they could stone her, and whoever was without sin could cast the first stone. And then he wrote on the ground for some reason, and then when he looked up, they were all gone. And then he said, "Neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more." There's a lot of weird holes in that story. The story never really exactly makes sense, because it's like, if they caught her in adultery, first of all, how did they catch her? That's weird. I don't know how to tell that story. But also, they only brought her and didn't bring the guy. Well, that tracks. We've talked about how evangelical Christianity treats women. Usually going to blame the women for stuff. Also, what was Jesus writing in the ground? Where did the other people go? A lot of people have added significance to what he was writing in the ground by just making up a story about it. Or, maybe he was writing something that the other people saw. Maybe they saw their names in the ground or something. I mean, there's all these stories within stories that people have had to write because the story itself doesn't make any sense. I am completely blown away to find out that that is not an original story in the Bible, that story was added by a scribe later. And I don't remember when exactly it was added, but it's fairly recent in the history of Bible history, in the 2,000 plus year history of the Bible and its various instantiations, that story is universally seen, even by believing Christians everywhere, as a late addition to the Bible. The idea that one of the most famous Jesus stories probably did not happen, like pretty much 100%. In fact, I don't think too many people actually think it did happen. They think someone just added it along the way, and we've incorporated it because it kind of works. It kind of vibes with the Jesus story. Blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind. Okay, so that's all about that. Like I said, this list could go on for forever, but I'm going to stop now and talk about a couple of other things before I shut it down. I talked a lot about how Bible scholars agree on a lot of stuff. There's almost universal agreement on a lot of things that I had no idea about, things I just couldn't even imagine, like the widow or the woman in adultery story. There's a lot of things they disagree about. I mentioned the Johannine thing, the John community. Some scholars think it's just a bunch of people writing under the name of John. Pretty highly contested. A lot of people don't believe that. A lot of people talk about the synoptic problem. It's a problem because a lot of people don't agree on it. That the Gospels have a hard time agreeing with each other, and scholars disagree as to why that is. One of the most interesting disagreements I found among Bible scholars is surrounding what people call the Q source, meaning, well, Q stands for the German word Quelle, which means source. Scholars are split pretty evenly, it seems like to me. That's my impression anyway. I haven't actually taken a poll or anything, but it seems like they're split pretty evenly along the lines of some people believe that there's another source and some people don't. Now, what I mean by that is some people believe that there's a source for the Gospels, like maybe an additional gospel, and some people even call it a sayings gospel. You can just Google that if you want, that informed Matthew and Luke. that Matthew and Luke copied a lot of Mark and expanded a lot on Mark, but also Matthew and Luke agree with each other in ways that Matthew doesn't. So maybe there's another source somewhere, a gospel that's been lost along the way. And so I keep saying we. So Bible scholars call that the Q source. Some believe it's necessary. Some believe it's not. Some believe that you don't need a Q source, that Matthew and Luke could just agree some places. The people who don't believe a Q source is necessary point out that there's just lots of things that kind of flow between all the Gospels, and some copy each other and some don't. That's a valid point. On the other hand, people who do believe there's a Q source point out the fact that Matthew and Luke quote each other sometimes, and it's very, very hard to remember a quote. They had to have copied each other, or copied Mark, or copied something else. If they say the same thing, but they didn't get it from Mark, they had to have gotten it from somewhere. They had to have copied it. It's very difficult to copy. If somebody says a phrase and you have, two people wait 30 years and then write it down, they're probably not going to get it exactly right. It's going to say something different. So when the Gospels agree very closely, word for word in some cases, they're probably copying it from somewhere else. And if that isn't Mark, or, it's not someplace else that's pretty obvious, then maybe there's another source. Personally, I don't know that one is required. I'm not sure that another source is required. And when they're saying that the different Gospels have stories that had to have come from somewhere, I'm not sure that that's true. I'm getting very used to watching people just make up stories and copy each other's stories and then pretend that the story is true. So the idea that that happened during the Bible times and people just wrote stuff down and believed it isn't too far-fetched, in my opinion. But the conversation is infinitely fascinating to me. I really think it's cool. I think that's all I'm going to say. I mean, I could go on forever about, Book of Enoch and Book of, Gospel of Thomas and all these other things that are intriguing and very adjacent to the actual Bible, including sometimes the Bible refers to places that don't exist in the Bible. The Bible quotes things. Paul quotes things that are not in the KJV. I could dig into that for a long time. I'm not going to, but I just wanted to share a few things that I thought were weirdly interesting about the Bible. I guess my final thought is that I have learned to really appreciate Bible scholarship. And I love listening to scholars talking very honestly and frankly about what they believe and what they don't know about the Bible, what they do know, what they don't know, what they think they know, and what they've learned, and how ideas about the Bible are changing over time. I appreciate it because it's not gatekeeping. I don't see a lot of gatekeeping around the Bible in that way. Whereas within apologetics, I do see a lot of gatekeeping. I do see a lot of people pointing fingers at each other saying, you're not interpreting it right. You're not using hermeneutics or exegesis or whatever. Dumb words like that. I can't stand those kind of words. I'm sorry. And to circle back to something I mentioned earlier, people thinking that their interpretation of the Bible is so correct that people who don't interpret it the same way are definitionally cult members. I think that's stupid. And I'm going to keep saying that. Pretending like the definition of cult includes a certain interpretation of certain Bible verses, or that that's a defining characteristic of a cult, is pointless. And I think it's actually really damaging. I kept seeing that come up as I was learning about the Bible. People calling each other cult members because of things specifically around the Trinity, saying like, well, only cults don't believe in the Trinity or whatever. Jesus is God unless you're from a cult. Cults do a lot of damage. I'm not going to go too far off the rails here about this, but cults do a lot of damage. And to pretend that the damage cults do is to teach a little bit of wrong doctrine is really damaging in and of itself, I think. I think it's neglectful of actual victims of actual crime in some cases. I think it's a real neglectful way of handling people who have actually been raised in cults. Cults do a lot of damage to people. High demand religions, extreme religions do a lot of damage to people. They hurt a lot of people. And pretending that the definition of what hurt them was that they read a verse wrong or had a wrong interpretation of something is really dismissive and kind of mean-spirited, I would say, and definitely doesn't help your case as someone who can save them by teaching them correct theology and hermeneutics or whatever. I think it's nonsense, and sorry to keep bringing it up, but it is turning into a real pet peeve of mine when I hear that. With all the damage that cults are doing, the fact that you would worry about one little thing like that is dumb. And I know that I'm being dismissive, oh, it's not one little thing, it's a major doctrinal piece. Cool. Help people get out of the cults they're in, and then maybe you can talk about it. But help them survive life first. That's just my opinion. Lastly, very last thing on this episode, if you're still listening, great job. I hope you go find interesting stuff on your own and find even more cool stuff than I've found. I'm going to cite a few of my sources. Like I say, I don't typically like to do this because I don't like tying myself to somebody else's opinions about stuff. So I will say right up front that I don't actually agree 100% with every person on this list. I think the ones that I've listened to the most, I have actually found that I disagree with them on certain things, whether it's an interpretation or an understanding of a verse or the significance of a verse, or their understanding of how Christians understand the verses in some cases. I think sometimes when I listen to probably all of these people on this list, I get a little frustrated sometimes because I think that they make assumptions that I don't think are accurate. So when I bring these names up, I'm only bringing them up because it's source material for what I was talking about today, but that doesn't mean I'm endorsing everything they say. That's not what I mean to do. I do like them all. I listen to them all. I think they're all awesome. I think they do a great job, and they are doing a great service to the world by educating people about the Bible. But that doesn't mean I necessarily co-sign everything they say. Just want to make that clear. My favorite Bible scholars / social media communicators about the Bible are, well, I'm just going to start listing them. First of all, Dan McClellan is my number one favorite right now. I think he does a really good job. I think he has a strange bedside manner to some of the stuff he says, and I think he's a little bit combative, but I think that's also the jam. I think it makes his stuff interesting sometimes. I don't agree with every assumption he makes about the Bible, how it's read, but I think he does a really good job of bringing linguistics into it. Linguistics and old languages. He himself has done renderings of parts of the Bible for different churches. He is a believing person. He's actually a member of the LDS faith. So, you can think about that when you listen to him. Dan McClellan has a podcast called the Data Over Dogma podcast. It's really good. Appointment listening for me. I listen to it every Monday morning on my way to work. My next favorite would be Helen Bond. She has a podcast called Biblical Time Machine, and she talks a lot about historical context and day-to-day stuff. She has historians on who talk about parts of the Bible and how they would be significant to people of the time. What were the customs back then, stuff like that. I think that stuff's really cool. Adding cultural context to the Bible really adds something to it. Let's see. Another favorite of mine is Shelby Hansen, Bible scholar on the Almost Heretical podcast. I believe she's a believer too, but maybe in transition a little bit. Always has interesting topics, interesting interviews, things like that. Same with Pete Enns from the Bible for Normal People podcast. I love that podcast. They do really cool interviews, and they attack all kinds of things from interpretations to cultural analysis, all kinds of stuff. A lot of cultural stuff. A lot of people sort of reinterpreting the Bible through cultural lenses, things like that. Of course, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman has a podcast called Misquoting Jesus. I think if you are listening to me, you've probably listened to Bart Ehrman, so I don't think he needs any introduction. So those 5 podcasts, Data Over Dogma, Biblical Time Machine, Almost Heretical, The Bible for Normal People, and Misquoting Jesus, I listen to at least some of those every week. They all get auto-loaded to my phone. I think they're all really informative and captivating. And each one of those has guests on who may not have their own podcast, but have a lot of great stuff to say. There are innumerable Bible scholars with specialties all over the place. I think the 3 that I'd like to mention are Candida Moss, Robin Faith Walsh, and Hugo Mendez. Those are my 3 favorites right now. They keep popping up on different people's podcasts, and every single time they have something really interesting to say. Okay, I think that's it. I think that's all the Bible talk I want to do. I just thought I'd share that because I thought it was interesting. I thought that maybe if you're transitioning out of the 2x2s, or maybe trying to figure out where you are in Christianity, learning about the Bible might be kind of interesting. So I don't recommend listening to this and just taking anything I said as gospel, as new understanding or anything. I'm just copying other people on this one. I encourage everybody to go learn cool stuff, learn about the Bible, interact with the Bible, dig into it, and allow yourself to interact with it however is comfortable for you. That's what I've done, and I'm really glad I did it. If you've listened all the way through this episode, thank you. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found something in it that was interesting. Maybe something piqued your interest that you can go look up on your own. Thanks again, and we'll see you again real soon.